Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook Podcast. Join your host, Bill Alpstead, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football. Welcome back to another edition of the Seahawks Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alpstead, here with Keith Myers, and we're going to talk some Seahawks football today. We're going to go over some roster stuff, take a quick look at the schedule that's going to come out tomorrow for the Seahawks regular season, and we're just going to have some fun. So thanks for joining us. Welcome in, Keith. How you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. It's we're in that spot in spring where the weather's starting to turn nice up here in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm looking outside going, this is probably the only thing I don't mind being indoors for right now. Anything else, I'd be like, no, I want to go outside. Yeah. But no, let's talk some football.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's spring here too in the Phoenix area, but
it's like 103.
Yeah, it's 98 or something like that. Yeah, it's actually it's pretty darn comfortable. I mean, the cool thing about it being this warm during the day is that when the sun goes down and it cools off about 10 degrees in about an hour, right?
Yep.
And so it's perfect for having dinner out on the patio and going out to a restaurant and eating outside, all that kind of stuff. So this is probably my favorite time of the year is April, May, just from the weather standpoint, because it's not too hot, but it's pretty warm, so you don't have to wear more than just a shirt and shorts and you're good to go. So, yeah. So what are we doing today? We decided, well, we didn't decide, did we? We had a reschedule on on our regular show that we had planned today. And so we shifted gears a little bit. We're going to talk some of the NFC West stuff today. Take a look at the Seattle Seahawks, how they're positioned in the division right now with regards to the way that the roster is composed versus maybe some of the other franchises and what they've done and how we stack up and what we think. So, Keith, what do you think? Like, describe the offseason to me for the Seahawks and what you perceive about the other clubs quickly, and then let's get into it and see if that perception kind of matches up with reality.
Well, so looking at it from my point of view, I think the Seahawks did a great job of plugging holes, filling stuff in, and getting better in a couple of key places. They're not, they haven't made these wholesale changes or anything crazy, but no team has. In a sense, you've got the Rams, which gutted their depth to add a real quarterback, so they don't have Jared Goff like running things. The Cardinals are continuing to try and build up that young team, but they did it with some really old players that may or may not help them get over the hump, and they've still got a terrible coach. And the 49ers they lost a lot of their top end talent, like in the secondary and stuff, but they were really deep before. They restocked a little bit, and they were super injured last year. So yeah, losing both their starting corners sounds bad until you think about the fact that I think they combined for like 108 snaps last year, the two starting corners that they lost. So it's not like the other guys haven't played. And so they're still going to be a tough out. And, now they've got, the only problem with them is they've got to figure out what's going on at quarterback, because we know Garoppolo is not going to carry them anywhere. They got Trey Lance, who has probably the highest upside in the draft other than Trevor Lawrence, but also has a lower floor. So how patient are they going to be with Jimmy Garoppolo? Is he going to be able to keep his job long enough for Trey Lance to prepare and get ready? Or is he going to play poorly and force the coach's hand and get Trey Lance out there too early, and this whole season becomes a mess? So there's some question marks with all the teams, and Seattle's in a position with fewer question marks, in my opinion. And I like their chances, but it's a tough division. There's no easy out out of
Well,
all four of those
it's
teams.
a tough division, Keith, and it's a tough schedule. I mean, we can go over the schedule a little bit too. It's not set in stone as far as the dates, but we know the opponents. Um, you're right, though. You know, there are question marks. There's question marks all over the NFL. You know, and you mentioned it last week. The only team that really looks good, that's got all their returners from last year, is the Super Bowl champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but their quarterback is 1 year older, and teams are never quite the same year in, year out. So we'll see how that plays out. But
Well, plus, you have the Super Bowl hangover, which affects every team. So they're going to come into the year, and they'll have to deal with that. They were notoriously uninjured last year. They made it through the season really healthy, which that injury luck doesn't tend to continue year to year. And so, yeah, I mean, they've had a lot of things that really benefited them, and they may not have those same benefits, but they're still a stacked roster. They still have Tom Brady at quarterback. Now, in some of those games, especially in the playoffs, they won in spite of Tom Brady, and not because of him. But in other games, yeah, he still led them. And so, yeah, him being a year older, what does that mean? And it'll be interesting to find out.
there was a lot of change this year. You know, we had Carson Wentz change teams, went to the Indianapolis Colts. Matthew Stafford came over to the Rams. You know, there's just a lot of Trey Lance to the 49ers. He may or may not start, but you've got the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks
5
in this
first-round
draft,
quarterbacks.
which are expected to come in and play
Mhm.
fairly well right away. And it'll be interesting, you know, and some of those teams are on our schedule to be, you know. So we at home, we play Chicago, Detroit, Jacksonville with the top draft pick, New Orleans, and Tennessee. And away we are at Green Bay, Houston, Indianapolis, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, and the extra game, Washington. You know, to me, and then you add our division guys in there. I thought when this first came out, opponent schedules first came out in the beginning of spring at the new year, I was a little concerned, but that was just before all the real changes, and kind of really looking at the schedules and so forth. And that schedule doesn't really intimidate me, or it should not intimidate the Seahawks, I don't think.
Well, no, I mean, you look at the Bears are going to come in with either Andy Dalton or Justin Fields at quarterback. I think Fields is going to be good. I wouldn't count on him being great in year one. You look at what's going on in New Orleans. Like, just go down the list of those teams that you
Yeah,
said.
Jared Goff in Detroit. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's Jared Goff.
right.
What is like?
What do you think of Trevor Lawrence in Jacksonville? I mean, see, Jacksonville was such a hot mess coming into the draft that you just don't know. New coaching staff throughout, new players.
Yeah, and a
new
coaching staff that just makes questionable decisions. They hired that one coach and then turned around and had to fire him like a week later after all the reports came out about him being, discriminating against certain players at Iowa when he was coaching there, and then you go, that was well documented and out there, and everybody knew about it. Why would you hire him to begin with? But Urban Meyer seems a little tone deaf when it comes to some of these things, and they just signed Tim Tebow, of all crazy things, to play tight end. He's 33. He hasn't played an NFL snap since 2012.
It's a feel-good story for camp fodder, dude. Come on. I mean, and if he makes the roster, it's good for him, but
Yeah, but
unlikely, right?
true. But you've got limited spots, right? You're only allowed
I've had a
5.
hard time finding 90
You're
players for 90 player rosters this year. I think it'll be okay.
Well, they are limited to you're limited to 5 tryout players. It used to be, you'd have 30 guys come in for a rookie minicamp
That's
and
correct.
as a tryout, and then 1 or 2 would get signed, and a couple of the undrafted free agents would get dropped because they either showed up out of shape or whatever. But you still have all this. Now this year, you're limited to 5 to keep the numbers down.
And those 5 aren't even going to be on the field with everyone else.
Yeah, you're going
because they're not having many camps.
And
in
so
fact,
you're
we
gonna,
just talked about that before the show. It's like we have a schedule that we kind of make up 2 or 3 months in advance, just so I kind of keep sane. And I had written minicamp review show in a few months ago, and they've since canceled that, and so now we got to make something up. So
Yeah. Yeah. So you're looking at that and you're only allowed 5 tryout players and you're going to use one of those on a 33-year-old.
he's not trying out though. They gave him a contract already.
Did they? I thought they were going to use one. Okay. So even then you're still, why are you taking a spot on your roster that you could have a young player with actual like promise and talent?
Follow the money, man. You got to follow the money. Somebody's doing somebody a favor. Some agent is calling one in. It's basically what it amounts to, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would think. I mean, a guy that hasn't touched the field for a while like that, especially out of position, he may very well be good and fine to make a back end roster spot. I mean, he's got athletic traits that, you just can't teach, but he hasn't put them into use for quite a while. So, all right. Anybody else on the schedule? New Orleans. This is the first year in a long time that Drew Brees has not been a quarterback in the NFL, and New Orleans is going to be rudderless there for a little bit. So that'll be interesting. Yeah, Tennessee, they've had some changes. They've jettisoned a few folks, especially on their defensive side. That'll be interesting to me. Green Bay, what's going to happen with Green Bay and their quarterback situation?
Yeah, because so far
is in their quarterback situation. It's like, my goodness, they're kind of getting set up to be a bottom dweller. Unfortunately for them, they're just so poorly run. Carson Wentz in Indianapolis, Minnesota is the same team every year. They have these high expectations and they fall flat. Pittsburgh is going to be a kind of a formative team where they're kind of diminishing, and then Washington, who knows what you're going to get there. So,
well, yeah, and
not a lot of intimidation there.
Yeah, you got a quarterback situation there, and in Minnesota, it's how what's going. Even there, let's say Kirk Cousins show, or when are they going to get tired of that and move on? I kind of expected them to this offseason, and they didn't. So there's a lot going on just around the league. It's just a lot of upheaval. It's been one of the most transformative years at the quarterback position league wide, and that was with things that didn't happen that could have, like Ben Roethlisberger retiring, or Tom Brady retiring, and there's other quarterback shifting that could have happened and didn't. And it's still this massive like year. Ultimately, to me, what it comes down to is what's going on in Green Bay. Can they get Aaron Rodgers back in camp, on board, willing to put everything forward and try and win?
Yeah, I mean, it's in his best interest. Making major moves at this point in an off season is really not beneficial for the player or the organization. And so, if it's irreconcilable differences, then if you're Green Bay, you've got to do whatever you can do to get whatever you can get and move on. And the sooner the better, because you want to be able to get your replacement guy, Love, all the reps that he can get and into the playbook, and kind of get that mentality of being a starter. If he's the guy, if he's ready, or if he's not, they've got to make a choice, because that completely changes the entire dynamic of that franchise. And it puts them in a situation where they're diminishing. So that's one more competitor out of the way for the Seahawks to get to and pass the divisional round and into an NFC championship kind of a game, I would think, because if you take a look around the NFC, the only people that are standing in our way is ourselves and our foes in the NFC West. And so that's why I think we were easy and quick to kind of come to a second topic today for discussion, which was, what's our roster look like compared to our NFC West counterparts, and did we do enough to improve and retain the NFC West division champion mode, or did we diminish, and are we falling back a little bit? And is somebody like the 49ers doing enough? And they've done quite a bit to get back to their 2019 level, where they didn't have the injuries and they won 13 games and took the division. So where do you want to start?
I want to start with the fact that The Seahawks drafted like a short cornerback with T-Rex arms. And
Yeah, let's talk about the philosophical shift that's maybe going on with Pete Carroll and that defense.
so I questioned this, and I'm like, I don't understand. Like, what is the thinking behind picking a short quarterback with T-Rex arms? And what I was given by a bunch of people was that, well, you look at the division, and there's a lot of short wide receivers. So they're looking for guys
Mhm.
that maybe aren't as long, but are um, quicker, right? They're better in a short space. Still have that top end straight line speed so they can get back, but you needed guys that were going to trade length for quickness um, in order to adapt. So I'm like, okay, let's go through and look at rosters and wide receivers that they'll be marking. Um, Brandon Ayuk's 6 foot. Travis Benjamin uh, is 5'11". He may or may not make the roster. Um, River Craycraft is 6 foot. You go down the list here on the 49ers, and you're
Mhm.
going to find 6'1", 6'2", 6 foot, 6'1". Okay, that's not a lot of short guys where you need a guy
They
who's
have they have
5'9".
unproven guys and they have really old guys. Other than say a guy that gets injured all the time, in whatchamacallit. What am I trying to say? Samuel. Samuel's a great
Mhm.
talent. I mean, I would love to have had him on our roster, but he hasn't been able to stay healthy when he's out there. He's a difference maker. Brandon Ayuk is a guy that I really like a lot, but
He's
he's not
good.
short and shifty. He's more of a speed
He's
guy, a
six
guy in
foot.
open space that's going to
You know,
get
Kevin
some
White's
extra yards
six
for you.
three,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so you have like you look at that, like there's like that's who
Juwan
they are.
Jennings is 6'3". Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, maybe it's not the 49ers.
It's
Maybe
not
it's
the
the Cardinals.
49ers. Yeah.
Maybe it's the Cardinals, right? Well, let's see.
Christian Kirk is
Christian
definitely
Kirk,
in that mold.
he's 5'10".
Yeah, but he's a shifty. He's a speed guy with a lot of agility.
True, he is. So there's that, but you've got 6'4" AJ Green, you got 6'2".
And old,
Um,
very old.
true. But yeah, 6'2" with DeAndre Hopkins, who's not
Hmm.
old.
And he's a possession style wide receiver at this point in his career, I think.
He's still really good.
Yeah, but he's not going to get the top off.
And you
Andy
look at
Isabella is a guy that's can get underneath you, and
but
Christian Kirk and Andy Isabella and Rondell Moore, dude. I mean, they just drafted a guy that's prototypical guy for a guy like Trey Brown to be able to cover, or Amadi. And you need as much speed as you can to cover that guy because that guy's got serious wheels. And so, yeah, I mean, I get it. I get the draft pick, Keith, and I'll tell you why. Is because
this is why,
of his
but
ball skills and his coverage skills.
ball
So when
skills.
you take a look at the
There's
arm
ball
length, yeah,
skills.
you can rule him out because of arm length all you want. But when it comes right down to it, the guy can run, the guy has makeup speed, the guy can stick. And so there's enough tools there where I get the pick. I don't necessarily agree with the pick. It's not the guy that I thought that would be ideal in our defense, but that's why I wanted to talk to you about the kind of a philosophical shift, possibly because while this wouldn't have been the pick 2 years ago, it's the pick now. And so
Well, and
what's
that's what
going
I'm.
on there?
Well, and this is what I'm saying is the explanation that was given was that the division where the talent is has gotten
Yeah, but
smaller and
from guys like
shifty.
us.
Well,
That are
true,
kind of looking,
but
outside in.
I'm saying like that. This is the justification that is being leaned on, and it's not correct. Robert Woods is 6'1". Cooper Kupp is 6'2". Right?
There's not a lot of speed in this division,
There's
other
not a
than a
ton.
couple of guys.
There's a couple of guys with speed, but there's a lot of height
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of guys that
Physicality.
play physical and can go up and get it.
Even Deebo
And
Samuel is a physical beast.
yeah, and so what have the Seahawks done? Where they've stopped looking for cornerbacks that can cover bigger physical guys, and they've started getting really small with short arms that are going to get beaten at the point at the catch point over and over again by the
But then,
bigger, more
but then
physical
they signed
guys.
Ahkello Witherspoon in free agency.
Yeah, to a 1 year deal. So they draft a player that they wanted, so they can have 4 years of team control of,
Mm-hmm.
who um, isn't going to be able to cover most of the people in the division whose names we mentioned. And
Well, I mean, yes, I totally get what you're saying, but they've also got a guy by the name of Ryan Neal. They've also got a guy by the name of Demarius Randall, who has previously played corner, switched to safety, 3 or 4 years ago, and then now the Seahawks want him to play corner again. He's like 6'1". Trey Flowers is a big corner, so they still have
so the
4 big corners that are good enough to be in some sort of rotation.
so
And they also
your
have the
answer.
smaller prototype guys like Amadi, and they brought in Pierre Desir as well, another big corner. So what I'm saying is, I think there's a blend, and before they didn't really have a lot of blend. I mean, we had Coleman, as a slot guy, 5 years ago, and then we sort of, before that and after that, we really didn't have anybody that was really that talented and played that kind of a role. Everybody's been big. So now I'm thinking there's a little
Your
blend.
thought here is that the people who are going to cover the receivers that are in this division,
I think it's a
if
matchup driven division.
is not the guy that they just used one of their 3 draft picks on.
Yeah. Well, at the
Why did you
4th
draft
round,
him?
Keith. Well, because in the 4th round, you're going to get best player available and a best player that's going to fit your division or your roster long term. And I think that they probably have some insight into that. As far as how he's going to fit. He plays bigger than he is. We know that he's a physical guy. He's a feisty receiver. He's a handsy guy. So I think that he makes up for some of that height and short arms with just the physicality that he plays with. And then I think that there is a balance on the roster between height, length versus speed and agility, because I think it is a matchup dependent kind of schedule, and they need both, and they have options, and then they've got a guy, Marquise Blair, coming in too. I think is kind of a wild card this year, who can line up in a couple different spots for you that enables other folks to kind of move around as well. So it'll be interesting to see. The guy that I'm really interested to kind of see if he fits is Pierre Desir. I think it's kind of an underrated signing in a sense, in that I think he immediately becomes maybe Ahkello Witherspoon's largest competition, not Flowers. And so we'll see if Flowers sticks even on this roster. I think that he does, just from the lack of depth overall, but Pierre Desir, I think, may take those snaps.
So here's the thing. So I love Pierre Desir. I think he's a fantastic. He's a good player and a fantastic person. And he is going to be an absolute perfect
Locker
guy
room
for the
guy.
locker room. He's
Yeah,
a locker room guy.
I get that.
And that was part of the reason why the Colts paid him when they did, because not only did he have a really good year covering, but he's such a good locker room guy. The following year, when he didn't have as good a year covering, now they were just paying for the locker room part, and so they cut him and to save the money. And then he went to the Jets, and he had another. Oh, it's the Jets. The Jets make everyone look bad, but he's had 2 kind of off years in a row. And do I think he can still play at the level from his first year in Indy and what we saw in camp and preseason when he was here in Seattle? I do, but I'd be interested to see if he can get back to that. If he can get back to that level, with that level of discipline in everything that he's doing, yeah, he should be starting. He should be starting on some NFL team, and if it's not Seattle, it'll be somewhere else. But he'll end up starting in a Ahkello Witherspoon spot.
Well, are we undervaluing Ahkello Witherspoon as a viable option in a starting role in this defense, where he takes 75% of the snaps or more, and then other matchups are matchup dependent, and so
he's currently the starter, and
I'm not
his job
mad about it. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like I liked Ahkello. I think he underperformed. I think he had some injury situations, but I think he's got the ability, and I think in this defense with this coach, maybe he gets some success there, and we've got it all figured out. I still think it's one of the least intimidating defensive back rooms in the NFL overall. I think our safety situation is pretty strong, but it's still kind of screwed up in a sense that, we've got Jamal Adams at strong safety, and then we've got Amadi and Marquise Blair and Quandre Diggs, and Ryan Neal can play a little bit of that, and Demarius Randall can, shift back and forth if needed and so forth. But it's not, beyond Adams and Diggs is okay. I'm not a huge fan of Diggs. He has his moments, and he has some good games, and then he has some games where he disappears a little bit, and he forces the cornerbacks to kind of play out of position slightly sometimes. So overall, I think it's the weak link on the defense. I mean, we've got a really strong linebacker group. We've got a very vastly improved defensive line. And then the cornerback group, even before Shaquille Griffin left, was marginal. And now that he's gone, they really didn't add anybody that is his equal, and or if you can put Witherspoon in that boat, but the NFL doesn't. I mean, Witherspoon got a 1-year, $4 million deal, and look what Griffin was able to get. And they were drafted in the same draft. So what else?
I mean, to me, that was, we were talking about the philosophical changes. I get that DJ Reed kind of was like, whoa, he was kind of a revelation, and maybe they don't have to be super long to be successful in this defense. And we saw Justin Coleman, for 3 years as one of the better slot corners in the league.
But he was a slot corner.
He had a very specific role. Now they seem to be making this transition where they're okay with these shorter corners in a division that is still dominated by big, tall, physical receivers. And can you imagine DJ Reed or Trey Brown going up against?
Well, I can actually. I mean, we saw
one against AJ Green, who's 6'4".
Yeah, but
they're 5'9".
Lesser of a player now.
Doesn't matter. He could go out into a spot, stand in one place, and not move, and then have the ball just be thrown up and jump up and get it. And those guys won't be able to do anything about it.
That's funny.
What? He's got him by 7 inches.
I think that, like I said before, I think these are going to be some matchup dependent scenarios, and likely you will probably not see a guy like Trey Brown covering AJ Green. It's probably going to end up being Flowers or Witherspoon or, one of the Demarius Randall or Ryan Neal or, somebody else with a little bit of size, Pierre Desir. It's likely that, what the situation that you saw with Richard Sherman when he was here, staying on one side of the field all the time, not move around with wide receivers, is probably changing. I think that they probably intend to move a guy like Trey Brown around a little bit, because you want to make sure that he's not taken advantage of with that height and jumping ability and so forth.
So you have to hide him from the opposing defense. It's possible,
but that's what you get in the 4th round. And if they're insistent on not placing him in this
other players
role, then it is what it is. I got to see him on the field. I mean, at some point, Keith, we can talk about all this stuff hypothetically, but at some point, I don't want to get too far ahead, because what if he is pretty decent? What if he is a guy that can make up some of that stuff because he's just so physical? I want to be able to see it, and then I can figure it out. But until then, it's hard, because I just don't know. I mean, the NFL talent versus the college talent is pretty significant, and I just don't know what I don't know about him, really.
So here's one of the things that I was thinking about. When Pete Carroll and John Snyder came to town, they set that NFL record with 282 or whatever it was transaction in a calendar year, because they were just shuffling the roster, just getting guys in, looking at them, kicking them out if they didn't have the talent, just shuffling the roster, looking for talent, looking for guys that fit. One of the first moves out of all the transactions one of the first things they did was trade Josh Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
cornerback,
He was
because
5'11" or 5'9"? I can't
he
remember.
was 5'10". He was
5'10".
but
Maybe I was thinking
5'10".
of Kelly Jennings or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so
Both those
5'10".
guys are in the same boat.
5'10" was generous. But go look at height, arm length, agility numbers, and stuff from when they were college. When they arrived, they walked into the thing and they looked at the roster and they said, "This guy may be good, but he absolutely doesn't fit what we're going to do. So we're going to trade him and get a draft pick for."
Mm-hmm.
So it absolutely doesn't fit what we do. And they just drafted him. They just drafted him again.
Yeah. Well,
So
we'll have to take a look at his coverage skills, because that was a big thing with Wilson is he didn't have any ball skills, right? So he was okay sticky wise, but he couldn't get his head around, didn't make a play on the ball. It was, that sort of thing. Kelly Jennings was the same way. And Marcus Trufant had similar attributes. I'm not going to say he was at that level, but he still had some ball skill challenges as well. So maybe a guy like that has all those physical abilities with those guys, but has the ball skills, has the physicality, maybe that makes the difference. I don't know. I'm just listening to what Pete says, and that's kind of what's coming out of his mouth in those press conferences, where those are the attributes that they identified, that they value, that he has. And that's the only reasoning that I can come forward with to counter your argument at all, because otherwise I completely agree with you. I don't know what the deal is. I don't know what the justification is there. There were a few other corners out there that fit their quote unquote prototype, but they elected to go in a different direction, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because I don't know that we know all the answers completely right now. I mean, we have an idea, but I'll be interested to see if we're proven wrong. What other position groups?
So the other big philosophy change that's happened, and it's happened over a couple of years in Seattle. It started last year and it continued in a big way this year, is the shift on the offensive line. Because prior to last season, they were run blocking. I mean, that was the justification for keeping Germain Ifedi around, is that occasionally he would take a defensive end and, push him back by the safeties as a run blocker. I mean, that, let's face it, that's where his strength was. That's who Lupati was. That was who GJ Fluker was. That's what they were. That's what they wanted. Last year that stopped, because last year they went and got Shell, who is not as good of a run blocker, but is a good pass blocker. They made the shift with Posick at center, who's not as good of a run blocker, but is a better pass blocker. Then this offseason, they made this their big trade and brought in Gabe Jackson, who is one of the top pass blocking guards in the entire NFL.
It's interesting that you said that too
guard,
about last year, not Jackson for this year, but last year with Shell and then Posick at center starting, and highlighting the pass blocking. Chris Carson had his highest average per carry rate in his entire career last year, even though he didn't have the chances and the opportunities. What he did have, he carried the ball really well. So maybe it's a good blend to have both.
Well,
Who
I mean,
would have known?
And so, look at their line
but Russell
now.
Wilson was still sacked a ton.
Yeah, he was sacked a ton because Lupati didn't play, and when he did, he was awful, and his backup was also awful.
Jordan
Simmons. And Posick got hurt, and Fuller wasn't great. Although I think he's got a lot of talent, and I think they want to coach him up and see what they've got in him. His technique was still pretty poor, and so that didn't work. And then when Posick came back from his injury, he was not the player he was before injury. He lacked balance and had a hard time keeping his his pads over his
Yeah, that last 6 games was atrocious.
yeah, he had a great start to the season, got hurt, came back, and just did not play well. So
That's why I
things,
was shocked that they handed him that spot again. Basically, I mean, they gave it to him and Fuller to compete against, and I mean, we had a chance for Humphrey in the draft, Keith, and we passed on it. I don't, whatever.
yeah. And so I just look at all of these moves and whatnot, and who is the guy on the line right now who is the big time run blocker who's a liability in pass protection? Because that's been the Seahawk prototype. That's what they've looked for in offensive linemen since Pete Carroll arrived.
Well, I mean,
There isn't one.
Can Shell be the answer? Because he does play on the outside edge, and he is a little vulnerable still, even with his athletic traits. He's still a middling, NFL average offensive lineman.
I mean, he's not. He's
I was
not a
going to
great.
say Lewis, just because he is a road grader, kind of a blocker.
Yeah, but he's also good in pass protection.
He is also good in pass protection. Posick is actually pretty decent, even though he's marginal. Yeah, but he's marginally decent.
When Posick was playing well at the beginning of last season, he was doing well in pass protection.
But yeah,
and then
so was kind of the entire offensive line
kind of struggling a little bit in as a run blocker, and then when he came back, he kind of struggled in both. So yeah, I mean, I just look at there, and there isn't that road grader guy except for Lewis.
Yeah, instead, and even then, he's not that heavy.
Yeah, and he's not a liability in pass protection by any means. So you have an entire line that is built around pass blocking, and yeah, Shell's probably the weakest link on that line now, or maybe Posick, one of those two spots. But Shell's going to have a tight end next to him most of the time to help him out. So you've got a situation where they have completely changed gears.
Yeah. Well, not only that, Wilson. Yeah, not only that, Keith, just if you isolate just the offensive line, that's just one thing. But then you add the offensive coordinator into the factor, along with what they're going to do with the blocking scheme as well, is that they're going to get into more of a rhythm passing game, quick reads, get the ball out of Russell Wilson's hand quick. This offensive line should take a significant leap in pass grades this year overall, just because the timing nature of the offense is going to really help them. Just have to sustain blocks 2.5, 3 seconds, and then they're done. So what do you think about that? Like, what do you think about the offensive coordinator married up to Russell Wilson, married up to the offensive line? Like, is that all set up to really be successful this year?
I think it is. I mean, you look at all of these.
Because we were all worried, that maybe we didn't have the personnel to match up with Shane Waldron's kind of outside zone scheme, where linemen are asked to get way out and deep.
Well, they kind of don't. They need to move laterally, but they need to move the person in front of them laterally, is what you have to do for the outside zone. And they're fine with that. Like, you've got that Brown. That's the system Brown played in Houston before coming into Seattle. They were the league's top outside zone running team during his time.
Offensive lineman guy there. Wasn't that Joe Gibbs or Gibbs?
It was Gibbs, and then
for a certain time, yeah,
it was Kubiak.
He was the OC though, right?
And the head coach.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, but those are the guys. So Kubiak and Gibbs were the guys that pioneered all the zone blocking stuff back in the Denver Broncos under Mike Shanahan, when they had, 2,000-yard rusher in Terrell Davis.
Yeah.
And then after he got hurt, and they would just plug in anyone. Ron Dane went for over 1,000 yards in a year because that system just worked so well. And and this is based on that. It's not the same, but it's similar. But the difference is what they do in the passing game out of it, and the motion and the rollouts and the moving pockets and that kind of stuff that they do to help the quarterback. And that's the kind of stuff that you're going to take a guy like um, guys like Quinn and stuff that are going to be coming in off the edge. And instead of having them, with their ears back trying to get around the corner to Wilson, they've got to move laterally first because they have to respect their assignments and in the run, and then turn upfield and get. It's just different. You dictate to the defensive linemen that they aren't going to just be able to come straight upfield at you, and I think it's just a great fit. You have guys um, that can pass block in that situation. You've got a scheme that works. You've got a quarterback that um, throws great on the run, throws a great deep ball when you need him to. Well, hopefully, but he isn't always best when he drops straight back and stands, a 7-step drop and stands there and waits for things to develop. That's not, that's not Russell Wilson at his best. His best is, making athletic plays and throwing the ball on the run and his amazing, accuracy on the deep ball. And so you've got to have a situation where you're taking advantage of those talents. I think Waldron, because of the offense that he helped coordinate in LA, will do that. And I think Schottenheimer was terrible at all of those things. So it's just a much different situation.
Interesting. Yeah. So moving around a little bit, what you said that the 49ers roster really impresses you overall. Like John Lynch there has done actually a really good job, I think, of
He has. I
roster
would agree.
building. Yeah. So in the draft, I thought that they nailed it. I mean, almost every player I love and would have liked to have had on the Seahawks roster, with the exception, I mean, Trey Lance, whatever. Weren't in the position to do that, but Aaron Banks at guard is an improvement and an upgrade for them. I think he comes right in and immediately probably starts. Trey Sermon, undervalued guy. Elijah Mitchell that they picked up in the back end of the 6th round as a running back, I think is an underrated player that really does have the ability to kind of help them, I think. So if you add Mozart and Sermon and Mitchell, that's a pretty nice little group. And then Ambray Thomas in the 3rd round as a corner, I thought is an interesting pick because he didn't play in 2020 in his college season, so that kind of he had a little hit against him in the draft for that. But I think he's going to end up working into probably a pretty significant role over time there. So and other than that, I mean, they've got a decent roster. Bosa's coming back this year. You mentioned Garoppolo. How long can he last? My opinion is that he's good enough to get the club 12 or 13 wins in 2019. And as a quarterback, he's not significantly different, and I think as a placeholder kind of figure in that offense with that many weapons and a defense that can kind of come together and be really good for them. Now, Saleh is not going to be their defensive coordinator. We'll see. That remains to be seen if that all kind of comes together, but I assume that it probably will to a certain extent. To me, this is still kind of a 11 to 13 win team, depending on their quarterback play. And you mentioned Garoppolo. I think he comes in. I think he's the starter initially, and we'll see what happens. But it wouldn't surprise me if he puts together enough to where they're winning games with or without him. And maybe they realize that they could be doing some of the same things eventually, by game 6, 7, 8. They could be doing the same things by just limiting Trey Lance a little bit, maybe, sectioning off the playbook a little bit, so to speak, to kind of give him the same role that Garoppolo has, just kind of as a placeholder guy, but allows you the opportunity at the end of games to affect drives. Trey Lance is a guy that could definitely put together drives for you that could win games with his legs, with his athleticism, with his just his athletic traits, where Garoppolo, he's never going to go out and get you points when you need them. he's a
Yeah,
competitor.
he's
If you're
that's not who he
ahead,
is.
he's the guy that's going to maintain that for you.
Yeah, so he's one of those guys like, yeah, they won a lot of games in 2019 with him at quarterback, but they won a lot of games in 2019 with a stacked roster
Absolutely.
that had Pro Bowlers and All Pros all
Mhm.
over the place. Um, a lot of those guys are gone. It's still a good roster. It's still a great roster, in terms of its overall depth, but the high end talent isn't the same. And uh, I mean, you're talking about Richard Sherman in his prime versus the guys they have now. There's no comparison, right? I mean, there's been a drop off in the elite level of talent, but they're still really deep and they're still good. I just don't see it as a roster where you can sit back as a quarterback and just be okay.
So I get a, kind of a weird thing, but, and he may end up being washed out. I just don't know. But they picked up Josh Rosen in the offseason as well on a veteran minimum contract. Talk about fallen.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah, first round,
is his
first
brain just
round pick.
completely washed, or is a guy like Shanahan have an opportunity to infuse a little bit of self-esteem and confidence in this guy to be able to run an NFL offense competently? Um,
I think,
I
I
thought it was
mean,
a good landing spot for him, to be
no, it's a
completely
great landing
honest.
spot for him. This is a guy with talent. He was a first round pick. Um, and that wasn't a miss first round pick. He came in as a rookie on a bad team, on just a bad team,
Mm,
and played pretty well. But they made the decision the following year when they had the first overall pick that they wanted to run uh, this wide open offense. So they went and got a coach and quarterback that could do it. They found a dynamic guy, basically, and that just made Rosen expendable.
mhm.
So he got traded, and he's just kind of gone from terrible situation to terrible situation ever since leaving Arizona, and never he hasn't gotten hadn't hasn't had a chance to ever challenge for playing time because there's always somebody else who's like the higher touted prospect. There's
Mhm.
Tua in Miami or whatnot, and so he's just kind of been stuck in bad situations. Now it's not a great situation for him in San Francisco because he's got Trey Lance, and so the likelihood of Rosen playing, I think, is pretty slim because they'll go to Lance before they'll go to Rosen, is my guess. Unless Lance, they just really want to give him more time, and they said, no, you're not playing, for the first 8 weeks, even if Garoppolo gets hurt. Um, but even then, you got a great quarterback mind, a great offensive mind running the show, good teacher in Shanahan. So you're going to have a guy here. If he can get some stability, a chance to really work with Shanahan and
Mhm.
and kind of develop him, you know, the other parts of being the guy running the show, uh, get an opportunity, come in, play pretty well, parlay that into a an opportunity, a chance to compete for a starting job, let's say in Minnesota next year. Um, it could work out really well for him. I agree. I think it's an underrated signing. I mean, you're talking about the third quarterback on the roster, but um, the upside that he offers is greater than what you're going to
Mhm.
find in the third quarterback on any other roster.
Yeah, to me, and we'll talk about Arizona and the Rams a little bit. Um, to me, it's a two-way race. You like the upside of the Rams. For me, I'm not a huge Rams guy, and I'm not sure that a quarterback change there completely did anything to change my mind. It could happen, but I don't know. I'm just not feeling the Rams thing, and the Arizona Cardinals have their own issues. Um, I like their roster, but it lacks a certain level of maturity about it, and I don't know if that's a direct reflection of the quarterback play or if it's the coach. Something's amiss there for me. Like there's no killer instinct to put teams away or anything like that at all. Their defense is pretty good. Their offense is, you'd think it would be pretty amazing and stellar with all the weapons around and stuff, but I think their offensive line kind of holds that team back a little bit. at least on offense. And then the Rams, there's just something just a little off about that roster for me. I think the Seahawks and the 49ers have the class rosters in the division. And I'm trying to say that without being a homer on the Seahawks roster. You truly look at the roster up and down throughout, and with Russell Wilson as the quarterback and the weapons they have on offense, and then the improvement they did on the defensive line, while retaining, some of the other key positions on the defensive side of the ball with Adams and Wagner and some of the others, and Brooks, I think, is coming on. They just need to get a little bit of cornerback play this year, and that team is legit. So that's the way I see it. Do you see it differently than that?
The only thing I would say is I think you're underselling the upgrade that the Rams made at quarterback. I know that Matthew Stafford isn't like a guy that fans are like, yeah, he's one of the top quarterbacks in the league. But you watch his tape, you look at his stats, look at everything that he does. If he hadn't been drafted by Detroit,
That's true.
he'd be a
That's very
superstar.
true.
But
Absolutely.
he's been stuck in Detroit his entire
Mhm.
career, on just a terrible roster. And so, I mean, you're in he is a significantly better player than I think most casual NFL fans think.
Yeah, no, he's a stats guy. So what I mean by that is he's going to get you attempts. He's going to get you yards. He's not going to be the most efficient guy. He's not the most mobile guy. He's not the most accurate guy, but he's going to pile them up. He's going to pile up the stats. The question for me on Stafford is, can he take a fairly legit roster, a roster that's been in contention now for 3 years? Can he take that roster and get him to the second level as opposed to Goff? Can he take the offense, the ideas around the offense that Goff could never execute? Goff couldn't throw a ball past 20 yards. Matthew Stafford,
Yeah.
that's all he does. That's his specialty.
Matthew Stafford, and this isn't hyperbole. He has the strongest quarterback arm in the NFL. Now, there's been some younger players that have come into the league the last 2 or 3 years, so that may not be true. But at least as of like 2 or 3 years ago, he had the highest ball velocity with the ball coming out of his hand.
That's been true since he came into the league.
Yeah, any quarterback in the league. I mean, the guy can sling it around. Goff was so limited. He was so limited in everything. Everything had to be short. Teams came up and played really tight to the line.
They learned how to play the Rams. Yeah.
It slowed everybody down.
So now it really does open that offense up.
It totally opens
Just
that
like
offense
it will
up.
Open it up for Shane Waldron here in Seattle.
Yeah.
And in fact, it'll look very similar, I think.
Yeah. And so it's like the upgrade at quarterback is huge for the Rams. Now, they've lost a bunch of talent. There were a bunch of guys they couldn't retain because they used all their salary cap space to jettison a bad quarterback and bring in a good one. But their top end talent's still there. They still have Ramsey at corner. They still have, that defensive line. They still have, Weaver at the linebacker. The high end talent is there.
Did they keep Leonard Floyd?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that who you were talking about?
Is that not what I said?
I didn't hear you.
I thought that's what I said. Okay. So if it wasn't, then I'm just,
Well, and they've got Cam Akers, and coming into his own, really.
Yeah, and they've got, they still have Woods and Kupp at receiver. If any of these guys get hurt, then the team's in trouble. And I think ultimately that's what's gonna take the Rams down a notch, is that injuries happen in the NFL. Every team goes through it. And you have to be able to recover from that. I mean, the Seahawks at one point last year were on their 5th string cornerback out there playing, and their 4th string strong safety was playing. I mean, that's how bad it got.
The beginning of the year last year was rough.
Yeah, I mean, you had Ryan Neal out there, only he was legitimately the 4th string strong safety, because you had Adams, Blair, Hill, and then Neal is where you get to. Yeah, that's where they were. So injuries happen for the Rams. If their guys, their stars get hurt, there's no one behind them. It's a long drop. They need Ramsey to stay healthy for the back end of that defense to stay good. They can lose some of the other guys, and it's not going to be that big of a deal. But if they lose Ramsey, that's not. I don't know how they recover defensively on the back end.
Yeah, and they were okay. Defensively, they were okay. You'd thought that their defensive line would make them a little stronger last year, especially when they played the Seahawks, right? But other teams were able to successfully keep them away from the quarterback, and teams were able to move the ball against the Rams. It'll be interesting to see. They brought in a couple of guys this year, as well as drafted a couple of guys. I think they ended up drafting like Bobby Brown out of Texas A&M, kind of a pass rush generating kind of guy, as well as Ernest Brown as well. Ernest Brown the fourth, I think is his name. He's kind of a run stuffing kind of a guy to help Aaron Donald in there. So that should help them a little bit. And then, yeah, you're right. The back end is kind of interesting for them. They lost their big time safety guy too. Moved off the roster. I can't remember his name for sure. Thompson possibly. And so it's a decent roster, but again, to me, you're right. The depth just isn't there overall. They did sign Robert Rochelle at corner, so it'll be interesting to follow him a little bit. He's a guy that we kind of looked at as possibly being a Seahawks kind of a defender, and it'll be interesting to see if his career kind of pans out there next to Ramsey if he gets a chance to play. Yeah, I really like our roster, Keith. I mean, to be completely honest, I wish we had more draft picks because we did so well with the 3 that we had, but maybe that's what made them so good. I think I'm a little more bullish on Trey Brown. I want to give him an opportunity, and we'll just see there. It's not my favorite pick by any means, but I think he's going to be serviceable. And if he doesn't work out on the outside, I think there definitely would be a role for him inside, whether it's with the Seahawks or somebody else. And then the left tackle of the future kind of a pick is very intriguing, although I still don't really know what we've got with that guy, Forsyth. But the first pick, Dwayne Eskridge, I think really has a chance to have an impact on the roster right away in a return role initially. And then as he gets used to Russell Wilson gets used to him, to have an impact, each week with 4 or 5 opportunities to catch the ball and get open in space. I think Shane Waldron has specific plays designed for him, jet sweeps, motions, etc., to get him into open space to allow him to gain extra yards after the catch. I like the roster. I mean, I think that like the 5th wide receiver, like there's some back end roster stuff, some depth questions overall, maybe a strong side linebacker question. Although right now Cody Barton seems to be penciled in there. KJ Wright's
still out there. Apparently, I didn't actually see it, but apparently there was one of those fake Twitter accounts where someone mimics Ian Rappaport or whoever.
Well, they didn't. They successfully retweeted a tweet by changing the date from the Seahawks PR Twitter account, and it said KJ Wright is signed. Blah, 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 blah. It shows a picture of KJ Wright signing, and it takes you to the link. And then when you click on the link to read the story, if you're not careful, the date of the article is 2017. So if you're not careful, you bypass that completely right away because you're scrolling through the picture to get to the text of the article. And in the text of the article, it doesn't say anywhere where the year or whatever. So people just kind of assume.
Well, ran with it. Yeah. I saw a news story from NBC that was like, basically like person on Twitter fools everybody.
Yeah. And everybody's kind of used to that, so you really got to pull it off to do it.
Yeah. So, but honestly, like the longer this goes, the longer it drags out.
It's tough. You know,
The
you
lo-
mentioned
the
last
lo-
week that he'd probably be looking at a $2.5 million contract, and I just kind of groaned out loud. I was just like, man, that is just so difficult
yeah.
for not only just me to look at, but KJ Wright. That's just why KJ Wright's taken the time, because whether he signs today or whether he signs next week or right before training camp, likely that dollar amount doesn't change much. And so it's giving him an opportunity to psychologically accept the fact that this is where he's at in his career.
Well, yeah, I mean, he made 10.5 million last year, had a good year, and he was thinking he was going to get 12. And I said from the beginning, he's crazy.
Yeah. Well, we both did. Yeah, absolutely.
That if he gets an offer for,
I thought he would be at 5.5 or
yeah,
7, between 5.5 and 7 with somebody.
yeah, if he gets an offer in that range, man, he better,
I agree.
don't trip over people when you sprint up there to sign, that kind of thing. But he didn't. Either he didn't get it or he didn't accept it because he thought he could get more. And now he's looking at. I still think 2.5 is what he's going to be offered, and that's
generous.
there's going to be teams that will call his agent and be like, "Hey, if he just wants to play, we'll give him a minimum deal. Let's get him in here."
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. Well, he knows he's going to, if he wants to play, he'll play this year. The question is, will it be at 2.5 million? I mean, that's really, a million over veteran minimum for him.
He'll get minimum offers because he's too good of a player not to get something, even if teams don't really have a role for him. But will someone give him, 2.5 million? I think they will. I think the Seattle Seahawks would do it right now, but he has to get himself ready to accept that deal.
Yes.
When he was thinking he was going to make 10 million more than that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Crazy. So what do you think of the running back room after free agency, the draft? We really didn't do a lot.
No.
I mean, we re-signed Chris Carson.
Which was huge.
Right.
I don't mind.
It is huge, but
you have your top end in Chris Carson. The only reason they signed Hyde last year was because they knew they weren't going to have Penny for most of the year, and they wanted someone to back up Carson. Hyde did that, and then he got hurt, and then he wasn't really out there.
I
And
really have my fingers crossed for Penny. I
never really did much. But basically, I mean, Hyde was there to replace Penny because Penny was hurt. Penny's healthy now, so he moved back into that role. So you're not losing anything by losing Hyde.
He's in isolation from a pandemic. I hope that he's healthy. Nobody's had a chance to lay a finger on him. Here's the deal with Rashad Penny, and the team made a choice in the draft in 2018. We're going to take Rashad Penny over Nick Chubb, right? We both like Nick Chubb a lot.
Yeah,
Nick Chubb had an ACL like early in his college career that had a direct impact on his health grade coming out. And Nick Chubb is the perfect prototypical Seahawks kind of quarterback, running back, and Penny was not. But Penny had this stellar health history, but he played in this soft conference, and who knows, right? So Penny comes in and immediately gets hurt, breaks a finger or something, and then that screws up his timing for 5 or 6 weeks, and he doesn't even get onto the roster really and suit up until game, week 7, and then it was just sparing after that, and then the next year he got hurt again, and so it's just been an uphill battle for him. And then this year they elected not to do his 5th-year option, which obviously made a lot of sense for a first-round pick. It would just be way too much money to give a guy that's only had 800 total yards in 3 seasons. If he somehow stays healthy, Keith, though, he could really be a difference maker. He's prototypically set to have a real big role in it.
Yeah, because he is the Chris Carson is an inside zone runner. I mean,
and this guy's 230 pounds. He's not a small guy, but he's got speed.
If you were to build, a robot that for running the inside zone, it would look something between Chris Carson and Marshawn Lynch, right? If you were to build a robot for running the outside zone, it might just be Rashad Penny without the injuries, because that's who he is. He's got that speed. He's got that size. he's a guy that would be, he'll be great in that. So if the Seahawks start running a lot more outside zone,
Yeah.
Penny's going to have a big year.
Yeah. Well, he's like Cam Akers is really what you're talking about, because he does have that opportunity. And I think the team should be excited. If he's healthy, man, they can do some damage there.
So you have the top two, and then behind that, it's what are you expecting?
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
DJ Dallas has, he's got the talent, but we saw last year he wasn't ready when he got his opportunities. He looked really tentative. He just was not ready.
He looked better than Travis Homer. He did.
Yeah.
He looked better than Travis Homer, but that's not saying a lot.
Travis Homer's tiny, and Seattle was running inside zone. I mean, that's their running game. And Travis Homer is a guy that is going to return kicks and punts. He's going to catch the ball out of the backfield. But if you want to run him up the middle, you're just asking for him to fail.
So that's why I'm thinking like a guy like Alex Collins makes this roster, because he's really the only other back on the roster that can take over for Chris Carson should Chris Carson not stay healthy, or they limit or meter Chris Carson throughout the year.
Alex Collins, when he left Seattle, he went to Baltimore, had a really big year.
He had like 950 yards rushing.
Yeah.
Unlimited carries.
Unlimited carries. It wasn't until I think it was like week 8 or 9 that he took over the starting job. Because he was, started out buried on the depth chart and then had to work his way up.
That's exactly right.
And fought his way onto the field and then ended up with 800 yards. And they run a lot of outside zone. That's a zone blocking running game that they used in Baltimore. Now, I don't know if that's true, if they've adapted to, since they put Jackson at quarterback, because I would, if I was them, I would go to a more man zone to create additional lanes for him, a man blocking scheme instead of zone. But because I don't know what they've changed. I haven't looked that closely at him, but Collins was there before that. So when they did run a lot of outside zone and that, he's a great fit for that and had all that success in that scheme. Honestly, he is a guy that if they hadn't been able to get Carson back, he's a guy that I would look at as maybe being, the lead back this next year. I mean, it'd be him and Penny, and yeah.
I think it's pretty good at the top there, those three. And then Dallas, and then you're probably looking at Nick Bellore being the special teams guy, and that's your 5-man.
Being your fullback.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think since the last time we talked to, Geno Smith re-signed, so that we don't have to worry about that anymore. Just trying to look at the roster here about anything that we haven't talked about. I think Kerry Hyder's still underrated. Some people are kind of poo-pooing that a little bit. And as kind of a guy that just cleans up messes and so forth. I think he's a little bit more than that. And so it'll be interesting to see how he affects that room, or if he can come in and displace a guy like Rasheem Green, because, Rasheem Green's job's on the line and he knows it, and he may come in fighting.
If he's a guy who comes in and cleans up messes, and when you've got guys like Carlos Dunlap and company creating messes, exactly. And then he cleans it up by actually getting the quarterback to the ground instead of letting him escape and throw it away. There's still value. There's still value in having that guy there. And then, I just think he gives them a more consistent pass rush threat on that side than Collier does, where Collier gives them the stronger run stuffing and might give them a pass rush help at the 3-tech spot, sliding inside and using his talents there. So I think it's good. I thought it was a good signing, and they signed him for nothing, right? It wasn't like they gave him a ton of money. And for a guy who had that many sacks last year, to get him for that little, okay.
So I think we've got a series of leading up to training camp of looking at the roster a little bit more in depth with each position group, and we'll kind of dig in a little bit more. And then accumulating is a special show that we've got set up in July, where we're going to all get up into Seattle and record a live show with Dan Viens of the Emerald City podcast too. So that'll be fun, multi-platform streaming event.
So is there a position group that you think going into the season is worse than that same position group a year ago.
Yeah, defensive backs, probably a corner. It's just, depth wise, I think Dan, I think nailed it last week when he said that depth wise, I think we're better, but starters, maybe not. I mean, if you take a look at our two proposed starters and you match them up with other cornerbacks from every other team in the NFL, we're in the bottom third.
No, I'm not talking about matching up to every other team in the NFL. Match them up to last year's team.
Well, I was never a Griffin fan, and I understand those who were. He was a little injured, and he was very inconsistent, and I didn't like his game. It just didn't translate for me. So I'm not terribly sad that the team elected to move on, but I, better, worse. It's the same, Keith.
It's the same.
It's the same.
Yeah. So and on the other side, they got nothing from their proposed starter last year, and they ended up shuffling through a series of guys before
It's like
DJ
they
Reed
knew
showed
that
up.
they had to work on it. It's like the same thing last year. They said, well, the defensive line is going to be our priority. And it never was. It wasn't in free agency. It wasn't in the draft. And then they ended up having to trade for Carlos Dunlap 5 or 6 games into the season because they were so weak, and they finally realized that they were. It's the same sort of situation where they knew that they were probably going to lose Griffin in free agency because they couldn't come up with that sort of money. And they went in with that approach anyway. They didn't elect to spend big in free agency. They got a bargain deal with Keller Witherspoon. We'll find out if that pays off, or we'll find out if it hurts them. And it really kind of depends on the defensive line, because the defensive line, I think, is really going to get after it this year. I mean, really. And so that could make the defensive backs better than maybe they look like on paper. But that's me kind of crossing my fingers a little bit.
I look at the defensive backs, and I think it's a wash. I don't losing Griffin hurts because he is a guy that, he might have been inconsistent and all that, but he was still a legit starter, someone that you could pencil in there. But he was the only one out of all the cornerbacks. DJ Reed wasn't even healthy at the beginning of the year. And so it took him a while before he, worked himself onto the field and took a bunch of injuries. And then he played his way into that starting spot. But you look at this at the start of the year, I mean, they got nothing opposite Griffin all year until DJ Reed stepped up.
Yes. Correct.
And
that makes me not have any hope this year that Trey Flowers is going to be able to step up either.
Yeah. And so you've got Desir, you've got Witherspoon, you've got a bunch of young guys.
Right.
You do have Flowers, there, and he had some really bad games, but he also had a couple of good games. So maybe we'll
through
see.
It, Keith, it makes me wonder if they're done. There could be 2 spots that they could add to on the defensive side this year right now.
Linebacker in there, strong side linebacker.
Yep. And if they could somehow pull off a starting corner somewhere, a camp casualty or whatever it takes, I think that you look at those opportunities, because I think it's a little light right now, and that's probably the weakness on the defense.
But still, I mean, it is the weakness on the defense, but comparing it to last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the second half of last year we were pretty decent. The first half was horrible. You definitely want to say that it could potentially be better this year out of the gate, but I think it really does depend. It is somewhat dependent on that defensive line, and we saw that the first half of the year last year.
Yeah, the first half of the year, not only did they not have the strength of the defensive backs because of injuries and all that, but then the defensive line was terrible. This year, the defensive line, they're going in as a strength. Rather than a liability. And so just look at the number of pass rushers this team has.
It's crazy.
Even with the Aldon Smith thing hanging out there, and so we don't know if that he'll actually ever come in and ever do anything in Seattle, or whether he'll get cleared and have a chance to come in and play.
The Aldon Smith thing with Seattle was kind of a hedge against Darrell Taylor in a sense. And that they still haven't seen Darrell Taylor on the field, but they were saying that he's healthy and all that stuff, but they just don't know, for sure. And so, but you add Taylor into that mix, and Robinson and Hyder, you bring back Mayoa, Bruce Irvin's still sitting out there. He's an option for maybe somebody if Wright doesn't sign. And you've still got Rasheem Green and LJ Collier, and they really like the Miles Adams defensive tackle thing, and Poona Ford's back, and they got Al Woods. I mean, that
You
roster
didn't
is
even
pretty
mention
stacked.
you didn't even mention Dunlap.
And Carlos Dunlap, you know, put the icing on the cake, right?
It's a good group. Now, when they were bad last year, right? Because
Mayo was taking 70% of the snaps, and that was
when he played, and then he got hurt.
Robinson was a rookie. You weren't getting anything out of him early.
Yep. You didn't have Dunlap on the roster. You didn't have Daryl Taylor on the roster because as his injury. Rasheem Green was hurt. You weren't getting anything out of him.
Yeah, I couldn't even tell you who was playing.
Yeah, you were playing. Jackson was getting significant snaps. Out there.
Bruce Irvin got hurt, you know, right away.
Yep, and so yeah, you had Jackson. You had what is it? Bullard was getting significant snaps at defensive end. I mean, if it hadn't been for Collier, you might as well just have gone and played with 2 defensive tackles and a bunch of linebackers because you were getting nothing out of defensive end for most of the season.
Well, and that was with blitzing Jamal Adams too at a historic level. And,
but that didn't. He was hurt for a chunk of when the defense was at its worst. He was hurt and not playing. So they didn't even have that going for them. They really just got nothing. And now you look at it and you're like, okay, it's more than just getting Dunlap back because they're also adding Taylor. They're taking Robinson, who flashed good things last year. And now he should be able to step up and have a bigger role and look good. You've got Hader to replace Rasheem Green if Green can't stay healthy again, to make sure you've got depth on the other side.
And then if Alden Smith comes, you know, we were going to set up and talk about Alden Smith a few weeks ago, and then that thing happened right before we were set to record, and so we didn't mention it. But you know, that kid's got 42 sacks in his first 43 games, and he went three and a half years without being in the NFL at all. Came back last year, played for Dallas, did fairly well in an early, somewhat limited role, and came on really pretty strong, I think, with 5.5 or 6 sacks last year. But he had 14 sacks as a rookie and 19.5 sacks as a second-year player. I mean, this guy's got all sorts of skills. It really depends on where he's at in between the years, you know. And if he's legit, and I think the Seahawks, brought him in 2 or 3 different times to really kind of figure him out. And they felt like they could take that chance, and then obviously something happened there. So, but if that plays out into his side of the story, Alden Smith will join the Seahawks as well. And somebody out of that group we just talked about will not make the squad because there's just too many guys. That's where we're at with that group.
And I think you and I have both both mentioned who is who has the most to lose.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 players, Rasheem Green and Benson Mayowa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. I think we're done.
Yeah. Let's call it a show.
So, what are we doing next week? I think we need to talk about it. We probably need some revisions to that schedule that I wrote up a while ago.
We are not going to tease next week's show. You're just going to have to come back and see what we do.
I think we're doing the Sports on Tap thing next week. So I think we're doing a general Seahawks conversation with some culture and some football talk. It'd be a good show.
Show collab. It'll be fun.
All right. So let's we'll figure out the roster. We'll get it out there. We'll put this show out there, and we'll be back with you next week. As always, you can find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. I'm at MW Seahawk. The show's Seahawks Playbook on SeahawksPlaybook.com on the website, Seahawks Playbook on Twitter, and you can find us on all your favorite podcast platforms and YouTube. So until next time, Keith,
go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.